2 days ago, Washington sent a demand to 7 nations. Send warships to the Strait of Hormuz or face consequences inside NATO. No phone call, no private negotiation. A public ultimatum delivered by a president standing on Air Force One, speaking directly to reporters. That is how the world learned that the United States was no longer politely requesting Allied support. It was issuing orders. The Strait of Hormuz is 12 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through that 12 miles flows roughly 1/5 of the world's entire oil supply every single day. When Iran's military capabilities began degrading under sustained US and Israeli strikes, the question of who would protect that corridor stopped being theoretical. It became the central question of global energy security. Trump's demand was simple in its structure and enormous in its implication. He told reporters he had personally contacted approximately 7 nations, asking them to contribute naval assets. He declined to name them. He then delivered what can only be described as a warning to NATO itself. He said it would be interesting to see which country would help America now with what he called a small endeavor. He did not call it small because it was easy. He called it small in comparison to everything Washington had done for others. Within hours, the international response had begun to take shape, and it was not the shape Washington expected. France signaled reluctance. Germany echoed that signal. The United Kingdom described its call between Starmer and Trump as a discussion of the situation and the importance of reopening the strait. That is the diplomatic language of nations that are listening but not committing. Energy Secretary Ed Miliband told journalists his government was intensively looking at what could be done. Intensively looking is not the same as acting. Japan did not commit. Australia did not commit. Italy was reported to be in direct contact with Tehran rather than coordinating a military response with Washington. And then came the move that genuinely altered the strategic picture. Macron placed a direct call not to Washington, but to Pezeshkian. France's president was talking to Iran's president, while Trump was trying to build a coalition to enforce Iranian compliance. 2 completely different diplomatic tracks operating simultaneously with no coordination between them. That was not Allied solidarity. That was Allied fragmentation. But this is where it gets serious. Trump escalated his pressure campaign beyond NATO. He turned toward Beijing. He told reporters that China relies far more on Gulf oil than the United States does, and should therefore contribute to protecting the strait. He said his planned summit with Xi Jinping could be delayed if he did not receive a clear answer from Chinese leadership. A presidential summit used as a bargaining chip. The economic logic behind this argument is not irrational. China imports roughly 10 million barrels of oil per day. Japan imports nearly all of its oil from the Gulf. The countries that benefit most from an open strait are not Western nations. They are Asian economies whose industrial output would collapse within weeks if Gulf oil stopped flowing. Trump is pointing at this reality and asking why American sailors are protecting corridors that primarily serve Chinese and Japanese factories. What Washington did not fully account for is the counter-dynamic its own pressure campaign created. Every country Trump publicly named or implied as a free rider immediately faced a domestic political problem. Their populations did not want to join an American military operation in the Gulf while watching American strikes continue against Iranian infrastructure. Macron's call to Tehran was not simply diplomatic creativity, it was a domestic political signal that France was pursuing peace, not war. Now examine the strategic mathematics precisely. Iran's military capabilities have degraded significantly under sustained strikes. Iran is no longer capable of firing 500 missiles and drones in a single day, but diminished is not eliminated. Iran retains the ability to inflict meaningful damage on Gulf infrastructure and tanker traffic. It retains connections to Houthi forces in Yemen who have separately threatened to disrupt the Bab el-Mandeb Strait to the south. Combine Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb, and you are looking at roughly 30% of global energy flow through two corridors, both under potential threat simultaneously. The International Energy Agency has already moved to release emergency oil reserves in an attempt to stabilize prices. Oil company executives inside the United States have begun warning publicly that a prolonged conflict is damaging to their own operations and to the broader American energy economy. These are not foreign critics. These are domestic industry voices telling Washington that the current trajectory is economically destructive. What happened next stunned even senior officials. Nations that might have contributed quietly to a multilateral effort are now in a position where any cooperation looks like submission to American demands. A government that joins a coalition because it believes in the mission can survive that decision politically. A government that joins because it was publicly threatened by Washington has a much harder case to make to its own voters. The underlying problem is this: securing the Strait of Hormuz with naval patrols addresses the symptom. The cause is an Iran that still possesses nuclear ambitions, missile programs, drone capabilities, and a network of proxy relationships across the region. Unless there is a comprehensive resolution that addresses Iran's fundamental strategic posture, the strait will remain vulnerable regardless of how many warships patrol it. Trump's three available paths each carry significant costs. He can deploy American naval assets without Allied support. That is sustainable short-term, but it validates the argument that America bears this burden alone. He can back down and quietly drop the coalition demand. That reads as weakness domestically and across the region. He can escalate pressure on allies and on China. But escalation risks fracturing relationships needed for a dozen other strategic priorities simultaneously. 2 days ago, Washington thought it was demonstrating strength. Today, it is discovering that strength demanded publicly, without Allied response, reveals something different. Not weakness, exactly, but exposure. The exposure of a superpower whose partners have decided that this particular demand does not meet their threshold for military commitment, regardless of the diplomatic consequences of saying no. The strait remains open. Tankers are still moving. Oil is still flowing, though, at elevated prices that reflect the premium of uncertainty. The coalition Washington demanded has not materialized, and the diplomatic landscape looks meaningfully different today than it did before that Air Force One press conference.